It is a delight and an honor to be here today. I really appreciate the invitation from your pastor, Cal Chin. What a remarkable person he is and what a ministry he's had for so many years. Now coming to fruition here and helping Calvary move into a new chapter in your lives together. I'm very appreciative to be here today. I'm honored and, a little bit overwhelmed by the fact that this is an interfaith service, and I'm a Presbyterian. So I've had to think long and hard about that, and one of the things I actually want to say before I really get into the crux of the sermon is to actually talk about the merger that just happened in this summer with the University of Redlands and San Francisco Theological Seminary. Because when we began to actually discuss the possibility of creating a graduate school of theology, a new graduate school of theology at the University of Redlands, there was pushback coming from both Redlands people and SFTS people for different reasons. From the Redlands side, they had been founded a little over 100 years ago by the American Baptists. And they had made a conscious decision back in the 1970s to eschew that particular tie and to become a secular university. And so now the worry was, is this going to make us a sectarian institution again? And they worried that actually it was going to narrow what Redlands University was going to be about by virtue of taking on a graduate school of theology. And then there was the reaction from some of the SFTS community, which was worried about, well, if we become part of a secular university, does this mean that we actually can no longer talk about what it means to be Christian? Not just as a kind of objective, study of religion's idea, but actually its practice, which is what a seminary is about. It's about bringing together scholar practitioners to help students discover how their faith can actually be put to practice. And would that be lost in this merger with a secular university? Well, I don't think Redlands is going to become sectarian, and I don't think SFTS is going to lose its capacity by virtue of the fact that we brought all of our faculty who have been teaching and doing a wondrous, marvelous job for many, many years. They're going to be part of the new faculty of the Graduate School of Theology. And they will take their place along with others who are scholar practitioners, some of whom may be scholar practitioners in other religious traditions. And that's a great thing. That's really about this idea that is really embedded in our own theology about the engagement of our faith with the world, whether it's with other faith traditions or whether it's with the secular society that has no religious inclinations or background. So we will see. This is really a work of God, and the future is in God's hands. But I think that's actually what we're celebrating here in terms of interfaith understanding and cooperation. So as I begin today, I want to acknowledge a problem with terminology. Calvary Presbyterian Church is following the tradition of celebrating worship in such a way as to honor the common bonds as religious persons who come from differing traditions and worldviews. The terminology often used for this kind of religious gathering is interfaith, meaning the three Abrahamic faiths which we've celebrated: Christian, Jewish, and Muslim. But there are other significant ancient religious traditions that were mentioned actually by Heidi that could also be included, which do not speak of faith in the sense that many of us do. Buddhism, for example, is not about God, but about the teachings of a man who never claimed to be God, the Buddha. So one never hears the phrase Buddhist faith. And then there is Hinduism, which has no founder, no single sacred text, no set pattern of worship, and no central statement of belief. Hinduism has many gods, and the gods have thousands of names which change depending on the local custom. Hinduism offers different paths to union with the divine. Some people choose a scholarly path, and others a path of service. Some choose a path of meditation, and others a path of devotion. Some devote themselves to Vishnu, and some to the Divine Mother. Some shun the worship of deities altogether, striving to realize God in themselves without any props or helps. Others mix and match. Most people think of faith as a body of knowledge or beliefs, as in the Christian faith. Used in this way, faith refers to a set of dogmas or doctrines, ideas about the nature of God, what Jesus' life and death and resurrection mean, what the Holy Spirit is, what the church is, and so forth. For Jews, there are the Hebrew Scriptures, the God of Israel, the Torah, the law, the Shema, the concepts of righteousness and justice, of mitzvah and kosher, the Talmud and Midrash, Yom Kippur, Passover, and other holy days of observance. A famous 12th century rabbi of Jewish faith named Maimonides came up with 13 principles of Jewish faith, but there is nothing binding about them. For Muslims, there are the 5 pillars: Allah, the Quran, Sharia law, Ramadan, and the Ides, the Prophet Muhammad. Used in this way, faith is something to which we give assent or not. In this sense, faith is something outside of us. It existed before we were born and will continue after we die. And the question is, what relationship, if any, will we have with this set of doctrines and practices? And truth is, most of us get hung up on doctrines. For instance, one might say, I'm not sure what I believe about the resurrection or about original sin, about Jesus' birth or universal salvation. This approach makes faith an intellectual exercise. And we call this intellectual exercise theology. And there is a place for theology, I know, because beyond the question of whether or not you believe or not in God, there is also the question of what kind of God do you believe in? A distant observer, a stern, demanding taskmaster, an involved, caring presence, a fount of wisdom, a passionate, transforming fire. The fact is, how we answer such questions determines, to no small extent, how we live our lives day to day, week to week, year in, year out. Theologizing is about thinking and talking. And in seminary, one of the things students learn to do is to talk the talk. Theological reflection, that's a good thing. In seminary, we go beyond the late night philosophical conversations in college dorms, and we dig deep into the traditions of systematic theology and intellectual history to think critically about essential matters of life and death and life beyond death. But talking the talk isn't enough. It's not the whole story. We not only have to talk the talk, you know what's coming next. We have to walk the walk. And that's what our scripture is about today, literally, but also figuratively. It asks us about walking the walk of faith and what it means to walk on water. The story in Matthew's gospel compels us to consider faith in a different way, not as a received tradition or an intellectual exercise, but as power. The power to act, to take risks, to accomplish unheard of, amazing things. Things we can barely imagine, things that we are timid about asking for because they seem so impossible, so unlikely. In this sense, faith is the power at work in us, the power we allow to work in us. Christian faith, in this sense, is how we witness to the real presence of Christ in the 21st century. Faith is walking the walk, not just talking the talk. In our gospel story for today, we see Jesus walk on the water, and then we see Peter try to walk on the water and nearly drowned. Have you ever tried it? Walking on water? It's a logical impossibility. Many attempts have been made to explain how this could have happened. All are pretty laughable. I think the best explanation is that Jesus knew where the stones were. But as one biblical scholar put it, to me, the challenge of faith has little to do with my taking things literally and everything to do with my taking them seriously. So let's put aside scientific inquiries and technical explanations, and let's take the story seriously. This entire section of Matthew focuses on the spiritual formation of the disciples, Jesus' inner circle. It's in this section that Peter emerges as a leader, a first among equals. And he emerges not because Jesus singles him out, but because Peter himself, impetuous Peter, brash, reckless Peter, has begun to grasp the holiness and the potential of this Jesus of Nazareth, this Jew. And he is moved, compelled, if you will, to try something new. So this story begins, as you remember from hearing it, at night in darkness. It's been a big day. Earlier, thousands of people were fed miraculously. Exhausted, Jesus and the disciples dismissed the crowds and escaped to the other side of the lake. Then Jesus dismisses the disciples and climbs the mountain to pray, leaving them in the boat. And while he's gone, a strong wind begins to blow, and it takes the disciples' boat out onto the lake. And as the NRSV says, the wind was against them. So now the disciples are distraught. They are being battered by wind and waves, and their sense of danger is heightened by the turmoil and the tumult that has overtaken them and wakened them from sleep. They are literally and emotionally unmoored. This is a metaphor, right? It's a metaphor for what happens to us in life, personally or in our relationships, in our institutions, our society, and in church. And maybe especially in the church. Tossed about, out of control, adrift in a storm, at the mercy of external forces, frightened and emotionally vulnerable, worried and anxious about what's going to happen to us and what the future holds. So let's talk about the power of fear. Life is out of control fear. The rug has been pulled out from under us fear. It's called fear of the future. Fear of what lies ahead. It may be fearful because of what seems to us a certainty, or we may be fearful because of the unknown character of what lies ahead. What we fear is the loss of precious things, loss of love, of friends, of wealth, of health, of status, of life itself. The loss of an anchor to steady us, of a North Star to guide us, of companions to care for us. This is a big reason for fear. And it's just such fears that make us human. There's not a human being who has not felt fear about the future. Whether it's a question of where our next meal might come from, or how we're going to pay our bills, or overcome our addiction, or battle a deadly disease. This fear is a powerful feeling, and it exerts real power over our lives. But there is a second kind of fear that I also want us to consider, and it's right here in the story. It's the fear of the stranger, the alien, the other. Those fears can also rule our lives, distort our decisions, and warp our thinking. It's the fear the disciples felt when they saw that phantasma, the ghost, or at least what they thought was a ghost. The appearance of the ghostly creature only made things worse for the disciples, heightening their sense of panic and distress and fear engendered by the storm at sea. This fear of the stranger is the embodiment of the fear of the future and the impending sense of loss. Strangers can be inherently threatening, although they don't have to be. Thomas Merton, the American Trappist monk, social activist, and scholar of comparative religions, once said that God speaks to us in three places: in Scripture, in our deepest selves, and in the voice of the stranger. And as Barbara Brown Taylor reminded me in her wonderful new book, Holy Envy, it's important to remember how many religious strangers played lead roles in Jesus' life. The Canaanite woman who expanded his sense of urgency, the Samaritan leper who showed him what true gratitude looked like, the Roman centurion in whom he saw more faith than he had ever seen in one of his own tribe. In Judaism, she said, they are called righteous Gentiles. In story after story, they enter stage left, deliver their blessing on the Christian gospel, and exit stage right, leaving their mark on a tradition that is not their own. Actually, as Taylor continues, this tradition of strangers bearing divine gifts begins early in the Bible with the story of Melchizedek, the Canaanite king and priest who comes out of nowhere bearing bread and wine for Abraham after a great battle. That is the story of Genesis 14, 4 chapters before our reading today. But in our passage this morning, Genesis 18, we also hear that God appeared to Abraham in the form of 3 strangers. We actually don't even know if they spoke the same language, although it's all written in Hebrew. But think about it, back then, how were they communicating with one another? They certainly didn't come from any common religious tradition. And yet it was another reminder of how God works through religious strangers. Again, as Taylor reminds us, for reasons that will never be entirely clear, God sometimes sends people from outside of faith community to bless those on the inside. It does not seem to matter if the main characters understand God in the same way or call God by the same name. The divine blessing is effective, and the story goes on. So let's return to the story in Matthew's Gospel. Though frightened, the disciples quickly discover that the ghost, the stranger, is Jesus, who is now walking on the water toward this small band of frightened, overwhelmed, and distraught disciples, caught in the fiercest of storms in the darkest of night. And with his words and his presence, he comforts them. It is a powerful image of help, of rescue, even of salvation. Some scholars think this could actually be a post-resurrection story placed in the middle of the gospel. But for Matthew, the story doesn't end there as it does in other gospels. Matthew shines a light on Peter, who is suddenly bold. Now Peter gets in the act, and he wants to be with Jesus. He wants to do what Jesus is doing, and he asks Jesus to command him to leave the boat and to walk out to meet him, and Jesus obliges. So Peter steps out, gets out of the boat, steps onto the water. He tries to walk the walk, but he begins to sink. And Jesus has to reach out and pull him up out of the water. So is the lesson here that because Peter began to sink that we should not risk what Peter risked? Did Jesus tell Peter to stay in the boat? Of course not. Jesus said, "Come on, Peter, you can do it. Walk the walk, Peter. Get out of the boat. Come and join me. You can do it just like I did. Walk on the water, Peter. Walk on the water." That's the dilemma we face in our country. It's in people. It's a problem we have with people of faith. We're sinking. But like most of the disciples, we'd rather stay in the boat and continue to what we know how to do than to try something we've never done before. Staying in the boat is sane, right? It's sane. It's logical. It's foolish and it's idiotic to get out of the boat. We know better. It's safer in the boat. We'd rather stay in the boat and talk about how frightened we are that Jesus has asked us to walk on the water, theologize about it, complain about it. We'd rather stay in the boat and wait for Jesus to perform another miracle on our behalf than to respond to the summons and step out of the boat and walk on the water. That's not the lesson of this story. Faith isn't faith unless it motivates us to risk ourselves, to do something we didn't think possible. That's faith as power. Faith as the means to do something for the sake of the gospel, for the sake of reconciling the world, for the sake of justice, for the sake of engaging the world with all of its violence and its consumerism and its indifference with a message of peace and community and compassion. Faith calls us to act in ways that bridge the gaps and close the distances between human beings. That is why Jesus walked on the water, not to prove how great he was or how unique he was, not to make us marvel as one would marvel at the execution of a magic trick, but to seek reconciliation, to overcome alienation, to offer forgiveness, to calm one's fears, to bring people together, to make whole, to make life, to give life, to make new, to show the way. At the core, practicing our faith is an exercise in living as if. Living as if something were true. As if we have courage, even though we don't. We pretend to have faith, and then faith comes. We live as if we care about something, and lo and behold, we find out that we do care. We live as if we are a covenant community, and lo and behold, open to the Spirit, and more we become such a community. Faith means living as if something were possible, even though we know it isn't. But then, lo and behold, it becomes possible. Living as if is unpredictable and at times scary. Like Peter, those who risk something for the sake of bridging the gap will falter and experience that sinking feeling at times as though the wind and the rain and the darkness are too much to contend with. This is especially important when confronted by strangers, whether they're people who look different from us or practice their religion in a way that is foreign to us, or who speak in ways that we are not used to hearing. As reminds us, Barbara Brown Taylor, however you define the problematic present-day stranger, the religious stranger, the cultural stranger, the transgendered stranger, the homeless stranger, Scripture's wildly impractical solution is to love the stranger as yourself. You are to offer the stranger food and clothing, to guarantee the stranger justice, to treat the stranger like your own citizens, to welcome the stranger as Christ in disguise. This is God's express will in both testaments of the Bible. The remarkable thing about the stranger-loving commands in the Bible is that they appear in sacred scriptures of Jews and Christians, which are honored by Muslims as well. Success is not guaranteed, nor is there any assurance that we will not endure difficulties, setbacks, unexpected consequences. But the measure of our faith is not only the willingness to risk, but the willingness to trust in God's steadfast, loving presence, in God's power to bring us through, to make the impossible possible, to reach out and to grab us and to help us through life's storms, to welcome the stranger as if our lives depended on it. The night may be dark. We may be afraid of the tumult and the tempest that surround and engulf us. But Jesus is calling us to step out of the boat. Let's be bold and walk on water. Let it be so for you and for me.